Well, thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person. It seems like a wonderful, I've really enjoyed our conversation so far. So the title of my presentation is Prophecy and Consent, the Case of Jonah. And today I want to explore the complicated relationship between prophecy and consent. I'm especially interested in consent as it relates to sex and sexual violence. After all, consent has become a dominant framework we use to think about these topics. We often assume that consent is clear, unambiguous, and consistent. And yet, popular representations of sex and sexual violence suggest that situations and experiences are often fuzzy, messy, and icky. And as a result, questions of consent do not always have the clear answers we might like to imagine. Queer work on consent also emphasizes these points, which is one reason that I suggest that consent is a fundamentally queer topic of concern and it benefits greatly from queer inquiry. In my previous work, most recently my book, Text After Terror, I've used both critiques of consent and queer responses to sexual violence to propose a new paradigm for understanding biblical rape stories. As part of this project, I've argued that consent is both insufficient and insufficiently feminist and queer as a means of diagnosing or responding to sexual violence. Today, I want to keep thinking about consent, but somewhat differently. Instead of demonstrating that consent is insufficient, I'm interested in what the failures of consent can teach us, especially about prophetic literature. And I'm interested in particular in asking, do prophets consent to become prophets? Which is a question that queers both consent and prophecy. In turning to these questions, I'm returning to material that I visited in my first book, the slide worked, Are We Not Men? Unstable Masculinity in the Hebrew Prophets, but with a sharper focus on sexual violence. When I wrote Are We Not Men? I was committed to finding spaces of queerness, and especially of queer pleasure, in the stories of the prophets' bodies. I still hold those commitments, but I found myself wondering more and more about how possibility and pleasure are entangled with violence, including sexual violence. I've also found myself thinking more and more about consent, especially after teaching a semester-long class, which was called Thinking About Consent. So you can see why that would be on my mind. And I've been deeply influenced by queer work on consent, including Leah Lakshmi Singh's care work and Jennifer Patterson's edited volume, Queering Sexual Violence. And so if you're interested in thinking about sexual violence from a queer perspective, these are two books that I would definitely recommend. Both of these works frame the way that I think about consent and think about prophecy. And so this paper is a queer inquiry into prophecy, consent, and their respective failures, with the goal of queering all three. So to give you a brief roadmap of how this paper will unfold, I'll begin by describing the trouble with consent, summarizing my own earlier work, and introducing some additional perspectives. I'll also give you two additional literary examples, Octavia Butler's short story, Bloodchild, and Kate Elizabeth Russell's novel, My Dark Vanessa. Neither of these texts is strictly speaking a queer text, but both show the limits of traditional, implicitly heterosexual understandings of consent. Next, I'll think about the question of do prophets consent to prophecy, with an emphasis on Jonah and his non-consent. The book of Jonah, I argue, stages the failure of non-consent. This is a story about saying yes when the cost of saying no is too much, in which consenting to prophecy is better understood as consenting to avoid violence. To suggest the contrary, that prophets freely accept the divine calling, is to maintain a cruelly optimistic attachment to consent. This attachment has real consequences. It devalues survivors, including Jonah himself, and it leaves the ickiness of the story unresolved. More broadly, analyzing Jonah's prophetic calling through the framework of consent reveals the sexual and sexualized violence of the prophetic call story genre, the centrality of ambiguity and ambivalence, and the complexity of harm. This is moreover a queer inquiry in several ways. Building on my earlier work, I assume the queerness of the prophetic body. I draw on the work of queer theorists, especially queer affect theorists. I emphasize the sexual scenography and choreography of the call scene, which, given the assumed masculinity of prophet and God alike, becomes queer. I offer a queer view of harm. And in lingering with the failures of consent and prophecy, I gesture towards a space of queer possibility. So all this is a kind of queer inquiry into thinking about Jonah and thinking about consent. And we'll see if I can, in fact, bring all of these things together for you today. So let's start by talking a little bit more about the trouble with consent, which is something that I talk about in my book, Text After Terror. And so I want to first talk about the 6 critiques of consent that I offer there. So in that book, I give 6 problems with consent. First, consent discourses assume a liberal Enlightenment subject, which prevents a complex analysis of rape culture. Second, Consent discourses ignore more subtle techniques of power, such as discomfort. So often consent is used as a kind of almost bullying strategy, ignoring questions of comfort and discomfort. Consent discourses ignore intersectional analysis, especially concerning race, sexuality, and disability. Consent is a legitimized form of subordination, so it doesn't make equal relationships. Instead, it kind of reinforces the power hierarchy and reinforces subordination. Consent risks becoming colonialist. And here you can think about the way that ideas of consent are motivated to save women in ways that post-colonial feminist criticism has really aptly critiqued. And finally, consent is a low bar. And here I think a lot about a comment from a college sexual violence activist who said, God help us if the best thing we can say about our sex is that it's consensual. So consent is too low of a bar for these topics. And I'd be happy to talk more about these if you have any questions. But for now, as I conclude in Text After Terror, consent discourses fail to accommodate complexity and offer an insufficient framework for understanding sexual violence. But where consent fails, critiques of consent, and feminist and queer critiques of consent in particular, offer a rich resource for thinking about power, sex, and violence. And so for that reason, I want to add some additional critiques of consent, which I think are especially relevant to thinking about the book of Jonah. So the first thing I want to add is that I'm more trouble with consent. Consent can mean saying yes when the cost of saying no is too much. It's a phrase that I take from the queer theorist Sarah Ahmed, who also appeared in Seed's work, and her work Willful Subjects. And I think maybe Julie, you're going to be talking about Ahmed today too. So lots of Sarah, we all love Sarah Ahmed because she's amazing. But in Willful Subjects, she gives us this kind of great analysis of the cost of saying no being too much. So Ahmed writes, we need to hear the cases in which yes involves force, but is not experienced as force. When, for instance, a woman says yes to something as the consequences of saying no would be too much. This cost can take many forms: financial, legal, social, personal. I may be worried about losing my child or my home or my job or my sense of myself or my sense of the situation or my understanding of how it means to be a person in the world. All of those can be things that lead us to consent when we don't actually want to consent. The cost of saying no can take many forms, and I want to stress this expansiveness. Consent can also mean consenting to avoid. Consenting to avoid rape is a concept introduced by feminist psychologist Nicola Gabby in her book Just Sex: The Cultural Scaffolding of Rape. This is a really interesting kind of feminist exploration of sexual violence. In interviewing women about their sexual histories, Gabby is struck by the frequency with which her interview subjects describe consenting to sex so as to avoid sexual violence. As one subject tells Gabby, quote, if I'd tried it, if I'd resisted, then he might rape me, you know. Gabby describes this kind of consenting to avoid as, quote, pointing to a complex gray area between mutually consenting sex on the one hand and rape or sexual coercion on the other. And so it's also a really interesting kind of case study in what it means to do this kind of research, because Gabby is very uncomfortable with this idea of consenting to avoid rape, but also feels like she needs to reflect what her subjects are saying. And so it's a kind of good study in what it means to do feminist or queer work also. And I'm interested in this idea of consenting to avoid, especially because of the ways it shows consent hollowing itself out as a concept. The next critique I want to add is the idea that consent is a form of cruel optimism. Cruel optimism, as you're probably familiar, is an idea that comes from queer theorist Lauren Berlant, who explains that a relation of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. So it's optimistic, but it's also cruel. Many kinds of cruel optimism are possible. Berlant writes, it might involve food or a kind of love. It might be a fantasy of the good life or a political project. Or, of course, it might be consent. As Alicia Kessel, who's a scholar of sexual violence who applies Berlant's idea of cruel optimism to sexual violence. So Kessel observes, quote, potential victims and potential perpetrators maintain an optimistic attachment to consent because consent seems so powerful. Through a kind of discursive magic, it transforms rape into sex. This is the cruel optimism of sexual consent. We sustain an optimistic attachment to consent as the evidence of agency that distinguishes sex from rape, when in fact the perverse construction of victim as agent and perpetrator as victim has for centuries facilitated the persistence of sexual violence. So the problem is, despite our investment in it, consent is unable to do the work that we actually ask it to do, which is to distinguish between rape and sex. Furthermore, our obsession with consent actually hinders our flourishing. In this case, it hinders the creation of a culture opposed to sexual violence. Consent is also a problem because it's suspicious of what I call the bad survivor. Sorry, my head is blocking my slides a little bit. Beyond cruel optimism, consent can be cruel in other ways as well. In order to work, consent has to be clear. I either consent to something or I don't. There's little space for ambiguity, for uncertainty, or for changing one's mind. So, for example, in some states in the United States, sexual consent, once given, cannot be rescinded. In other contexts, any kind of hesitation or uncertainty functions as an absolute removal of consent. So, you see this, for example, in the US in many campus sexual violence policies, which specify enthusiastic consent or consent at every stage. Because of the premium placed on certainty and clear boundaries, there's often suspicion placed on the figure that I will call the bad victim or the bad survivor. The bad victim or the bad survivor, and I hope you can hear the kind of capital letters there, right? Like this is a concept. The bad victim is the one who didn't say no clearly enough or who sent mixed signals. She may have mixed feelings about consent education and about what several authors in queering sexual violence call the survivor industrial complex, which is obsessively focused on consent. She may be traumatized. She may not be healing in the ways we would like. She may have an inappropriate or unsettling relationship with her perpetrator. She may not have cut things off. She may be a perpetrator herself. More than anything, the bad victim or the bad survivor reminds us that consent has failed, and she shows us the cruelty of our optimistic attachments. And so for that reason, she becomes a figure that's marked as bad. And here we can think about affect theory in the way that she becomes a kind of unhappy object from the perspective of the system that's trying to prevent sexual violence. And then finally, and really importantly, consent doesn't resolve ickiness. Icky sex can be consensual. Consensual sex can be icky. Consent will not abolish disgust and discomfort. However, we might hope it would do so. And our obsession with consent can become icky when it leads us to judgment or limits the capaciousness of our sexual politics and our feminist and queer sexual imagination. And I think this is true when we're thinking about biblical texts as well as when we're thinking about contemporary contexts. So with this critique of consent really briefly outlined, I want to give you two contemporary examples before turning to the biblical text. The first contemporary example, fairly contemporary, it's from the 1980s, is Octavia Butler's short story Bloodchild, which won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards. Those are big awards in science fiction. Published in 1984, Bloodchild describes the relationship between a community of humans living on an alien planet and the Tlick, who are giant insect-like aliens. The humans live under Tlick control. The Tlick have difficulty reproducing, and so they have to implant their eggs in human hosts. Male hosts are especially desirable for incubating Tlick eggs. The narrator of the story is a boy named Gon, who's been chosen by Tagatoi, a Tlick female, to carry her egg. Gon's sister is jealous because she wants to be the one to carry the egg, but Gon is uncertain if he actually wants to go through with it. His fear grows as, partway through the story, he encounters another human host who's a man named Bran Lomas. Bran Lomas is an example of kind of the hosting process gone wrong. He's being eaten alive from the inside by the hatched Tlick offspring. So he tried to run away, and then aliens weren't present at the right time, and so now he's being eaten alive by their young from the inside. Sorry, this is a little bit of a gruesome story, but it's a very interesting one. Nevertheless, Gon eventually consents to having the egg implanted, in part to protect his sister from having to do so, in part out of his love for Tagatoi. Octavia Butler described Bloodchild as an unconventional love story. More frequently, readers and critics have argued it's a story about sexual exploitation and abuse under slavery or a study of consent. The question of does Gon consent is in many ways the central query of the tale. And relevant to our exploration here, the story also thematizes several of the points critiquing consent that I've already introduced today. Because the Tlick, or the aliens, hold the power, physically, politically, and pharmacologically, the eggs that they implant are also intoxicating. In the world of Bloodchild, human consent to implantation can take the form of consenting to avoid. Gon describes how previously, some humans were forced to incubate eggs against their will. Gon may consent to the implantation to avoid being forced to do so. Or his consent to the egg can be interpreted as saying yes when the cost of saying no is too much. In his case, protecting his sister, but also protecting his understanding of his relationship with Tagatoi as a relationship of love and care. This points to the cruel optimism of the situation of forced human surrogacy. And there's a lingering ickiness in the story, even or especially if we take seriously Butler's characterization of her work as a love story. So I teach this text, and when I tell the students it's a love story, they're always completely horrified, and yet that's how Butler herself kind of understood it. And I think there's the ickiness we feel towards that judgment is itself interesting and telling. My second literary example of the difficulties of consent is Kate Elizabeth Russell's 2021 novel, My Dark Vanessa. Unlike Bloodchild, this is a story set in our world. toggling between the narrator Vanessa's freshman year at an elite boarding school in Maine and her reckoning with her past 20 years later. While a student, Vanessa has what she describes as a dark love affair with her middle aged English teacher, whose name is Jacob Strain. When the affair is revealed, she's expelled from the school. Much later, in her 30s, Vanessa still struggles with the aftermath of the affair and with whether what happened to her is better described as grooming and sexual assault. But, and this is what's most frustrating about the novel, but also what's most compelling, I think, Vanessa resists the pull of the Oprah style narrative of self realization and then healing. Vanessa is a bad survivor. She is never really better, even as the book comes to an end with her getting a rescue dog, which is such a cheesy ending that it kind of shows the overwhelming sort of failure to resolve this ickiness throughout the novel, I think. You can't rape the willing, she jokes with a friend savagely. No less brutal is her wrenching confession to a therapist that, quote, I just really need it to be a love story. Vanessa's story, past and present, is overwhelmingly icky. Talking with students about the novel, they kept describing how icky they felt while reading it, while also talking about how they couldn't put it down. And so this is another good example of sort of what this sort of stories do to us. Beyond the ickiness and the bad survivor, My Dark Vanessa gives us a searing example of consent as cruel optimism. Vanessa insists that she is a willing participant in everything that happens, precisely because the alternative, which is seeing herself as a victim, would be even more shattering. There's even a cruel parody of consent, as Strain repeatedly asks the 15-year-old Vanessa to consent to every specific sexual act, even as he does so having created a situation, including secrecy, alcohol, the fact that he's her teacher, she's at a boarding school, where she cannot say no. And Vanessa even admits to herself that she consents to avoid. And so I think that both of these stories, neither of them is a traditional kind of queer story, but both of them show why our model of consent, which is often predicated on heterosexual relationships, is really inadequate at kind of speaking to all of these difficulties. So with all that in mind, I want to turn now from consent to thinking about prophecy. And I want to think about the question of, do prophets consent to prophecy? A good starting point to answer this question is to look at the call stories of the major prophets. The clearest example of consent comes from Isaiah. Isaiah has a vision of God in the temple, seated on his throne and surrounded by adoring seraphim. When the prophet laments his unclean lips, a seraph flies over and touches them with a coal, cleansing them. And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? To which Isaiah replies, Hineni, shalachni, here I am, send me. This is consent that would please any college sexual health educator, unambiguous, verbal, and enthusiastic. Jeremiah and Ezekiel offer somewhat more complex examples. Jeremiah, famously, is called before birth. Now the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Upon hearing these words, Jeremiah protests, and negotiation with God ensues, not unlike Moses' prophetic calling at the burning bush. God also places his words in Jeremiah's mouth. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, now I put my words in your mouth, opening his body without necessarily seeking consent to do so. Still, Jeremiah takes quickly to prophecy. And I think the issue with Jeremiah is not so much his refusal to consent at the beginning of his prophetic calling, but rather his changed understanding later on. So you could think about something like Jeremiah 27, you seduced me, you overpowered me, and you prevailed. I'm also interested in thinking about Jeremiah as a kind of bad survivor, which touches on some of these questions about consent. And some of your comments about Jeremiah early on are something I want to think more about too. Ezekiel, meanwhile, hardly speaks in his call story. His only objection is to God's command in Ezekiel 4:9-11 to cook bread over human excrement. His specific objection to this one portion of the call can be interpreted as his general acceptance of the prophetic calling more broadly. And then there's Jonah. The key scenes are two prophetic calls that Jonah receives in the beginning of chapter 1 and then again at the beginning of chapter 3. Let's revisit the opening lines of the book. And this is from the translation. Steve McKenzie and John Kaltner and I are finishing up a new Jonah commentary, and so this is from our translation to that. Jonah, the son of Amittai, received the message from Yahweh that said, get up and go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry out against it, because its evil has come to my attention. So Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish, away from Yahweh. Going down to Joppa, he found a ship headed to Tarshish. He paid the fare and boarded it to travel with them to Tarshish, away from Yahweh. Jonah's attempt at flight, as we all know, fails. God sends a storm and waylays the ship. Jonah reveals his identity, is thrown overboard at his demand, and is swallowed by a giant fish. And Sione, I love what you did with the fish. I want to think more about that too. After 3 days in the fish, he's vomited out. And when Jonah receives the message from Yahweh a second time in chapter 3, verse 1, he doesn't attempt to flee again. Jonah's actions are often read as signs of his resistance or his unsuitability as a prophet. Sometimes they're even interpreted comically. Jonah, the prophet who does everything wrong and yet succeeds, the inverse of a prophet such as Jeremiah or Ezekiel, who prophesies correctly and nevertheless fails. Another trajectory of interpretation treats Jonah's actions as righteous protest. Jonah will not prophesy because, out of solidarity with Israel, he does not want Israel's enemy, the wicked Assyrians, to receive mercy. I want to suggest, however, that we can read Jonah's actions differently, as tactics of resistance that signal his non-consent to prophecy, while also revealing the inappositeness of consent as an approach. First, Jonah's non-consent. It's true, and much discussed, that Jonah does not respond verbally to God's command to go and prophesy to Nineveh. This silence alone does not necessarily mean non-consent. Among the other biblical prophets, only Isaiah offers an unambiguous verbal consent to prophecy, even as feminists and queer activists and scholars have increasingly pushed back against the implication that consent needs to be verbal. And often that's based on a kind of reading of disability studies or CRIP approaches, kind of critiquing the focus on the verbal as ableist. More significant, I think, is that asking, does Jonah consent, means assuming that Jonah is the sort of person who's able to consent. In contemporary discussions of consent, this usually means the self-contained, self-knowing, liberal enlightenment subject. In other words, you can't consent if you're drunk, ecstatic, mentally impaired, or otherwise out of your mind. You also can't consent if you're not a subject. Thus, children, animals, slaves, and women are all categories of persons who, at one time or another, could not or cannot consent. Consent also raises questions of vertical relationships. In an extremely hierarchical relationship, consent becomes a meaningless notion. 23-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky's so-called affair with U.S. President Bill Clinton is one such example. Ghan's consent to have Tagatoy's eggs implanted is another. To say that Jonah had any choice in the matter, that Jonah could have consented or not, is to cling to the cruel optimism of consent. Jonah does not wish to be a prophet, Jonah does not consent, but also cannot withhold consent, and so he flees, but also his non-consent doesn't matter because his flight doesn't work. All of this may seem obvious. My point is not that prophecy isn't, in fact, a take it or leave it, consent or don't option that's presented to potential prophets. My point instead is that thinking about consent and sexual violence and bodies and power through this example helps us understand all of them more fully. So what do we learn about prophecy, prophetic bodies, sex, and violence when we make Jonah's non-consent our starting point? First, Jonah's consent to prophecy is an example of saying yes when the cost of saying no is too much. There's no actual choice in the scene of prophetic calling, as Jonah learns in chapters 1 and 2. The flip side is that Jonah cannot really consent to being a prophet against Nineveh in chapter 3, even as he goes along with God's command. Just as my dark Vanessa's 15-year-old Vanessa cannot really consent or not consent to an affair with her teacher, and just as Ghan cannot really consent or not consent to being implanted with Tagatoy's young, the failure is the point. Jonah, in chapter 3, Vanessa, and Ghan all say yes when the cost of saying no is too much. Second, Jonah's consent in chapter 3 is a form of consenting to avoid. In this case, to avoid a repetition of the outrageous divine punishment he receives in chapter 2. Well, the fish is sometimes presented as a respite and perhaps even a cozy abode. So Stephen Mitchell has a poem about how nice it is to be in the fish. Interestingly enough, Aldous Huxley has a poem about how lovely it is to be in the fish, but many other sources stress the experience as something that resembles torture. And you see this especially in medieval Jewish and Christian sources. And so Jonah is consenting to avoid, right? And here what he's trying to avoid is this torturous punishment. Third, the story of Jonah exposes the cruel optimism, not just of the prophetic calling, but of prophecy itself. I've already made clear that suggesting Jonah had the option to consent to prophecy or not requires a cruelly optimistic attachment to consent. But now I want to suggest that prophecy itself is a cruelly optimistic endeavor. Jonah himself makes this clear in chapter 4, after he's prophesied to Nineveh and succeeded in bringing about their repentance, causing God to change his mind about the destruction. Jonah angrily announces, "Oh Yahweh, this is what I thought when I was in my own country, isn't it? This is the reason I fled towards Tarshish before, because I knew you to be a gracious and merciful God, slow to get angry, very kind in changing your mind about bringing harm," and then expresses his desire to die. With his speech and actions throughout chapter 4, Jonah exposes the lie of prophecy and the cruel optimism of believing it'll change anything. Fourth, Jonah is a bad survivor, And the fact that he's a bad survivor explains the failure to take his original non-consent seriously. In chapter 4, Jonah displays all the signs of a bad survivor. His attitude is inappropriate to the situation. He vacillates wildly between anger and joy over an inappropriate object, a simple plant no less. Mostly he expresses the desire to die. Previously, I've described Jonah as a prophetic failure, characterized by his refusal and his status as an affect alien and melancholic migrant. And those are also categories I adopt from Sarah Ahmed, here from her book, The Promise of Happiness. In a somewhat related vein, Karen Bray has described Jonah as moody. Now I want to push further and identify Jonah specifically as a bad survivor. Furthermore, Jonah's status as bad survivor can help explain the dominant responses to Jonah 1, which treat the prophet's refusal as stubbornness, small-mindedness, or even comedy. And these explanations will also resurface in attempts to explain his anger in chapter 4. Because Jonah is a bad survivor, the fact that he doesn't consent can't be taken seriously. This is also something we might know that's common in responses to sexual violence and other trauma, and it also explains the reception of the biblical text as well. So you can think about how a bad victim or a bad survivor, we won't kind of accept the fact their own narrative of not consenting to something because it goes against this larger sort of framework. Fifth, consent does not resolve ickiness. Even if we accept that Jonah freely and enthusiastically consents in chapter 3, an assumption I would put pressure on, all is not well. The story maintains its ickiness. Whether we understand this ickiness as the sparing of the wicked Ninevites, which is icky in the pity shown to terrible people, as Jonah's response, which is icky in its refusal to accommodate mercy, or icky in the unfinished ending of the story, which is icky just because it's a failure to find closure. So any way you slice it, it's an icky story, and consent can help us. We can see that consent doesn't resolve ickiness. Having made my way through the 5 critiques of consent I've levied, I want to mention briefly 3 other queer insights that reading Jonah together with consent and non-consent offers up. First, the prophetic call story as a genre resembles a scene of sexual non-consent. Using Jonah to interrogate prophecy and consent reveals the violence, including sexualized violence, of the prophetic call story genre. The calling of a prophet instigates a relationship of intimacy, but it's inarguably a relation shot through with vertical power hierarchies. It's a scene in which consent is impossible. There's not actual sexual violence in the prophetic call stories, so structural similarities are nevertheless striking. And I think here you could think about how we are very attuned to see violence in the marriage metaphor because it's a heterosexual marriage metaphor, whereas we don't always see it in the call stories precisely because of our own kind of queer-phobic reading biases. Second, consent and non-consent focalize the centrality of ambiguity and ambivalence to the prophetic calling. One reason that consent is so appealing as a notion is that it suggests clear delineation between appropriate and inappropriate, between sex and rape, between lovers and perpetrators, between victims and willing participants. It's even common to compare consent to a traffic signal. Green means go, red means stop. But consent is not straightforward, and neither is prophecy. Jonah 4 is an extended staging of the prophet's ambivalence and anger. The gratitude the speaker expresses in the psalm in chapter 2 is likewise at odds with the remainder of the book. We find similar ambiguities and ambivalences across the prophetic corpus. I've already referred to Jeremiah's regret over accepting the prophetic word, his sense of being overpowered and deceived. A more contemporary example that I think also helps us think about ambivalence and consent is Tony Kushner's play Angels in America, which really helps us think about queer ambivalence and prophecy. And then third, taking non-consent seriously demands that we undertake a more complex representation of harm. Of all the ways that an easy, simplistic reliance on consent can be damaging, one of the most significant, to my mind, is the way that consent discourses flatten the idea of harm. It's compelling, in the case of Jonah, to seek a straightforward representation of harm, whether harm to the prophet, either by God or by commentators or by his own actions, harm to the Israelites by the Assyrians, harm to the notion of mercy by Jonah's small-mindedness, or harm to meaning by the book's frustrating ending. Queer readings are not immune to this desire. We understand Jonah's hurt through his queerness, or his queerness is a form of harm. Queer readings often become frustrated and melancholic readings, and I myself am guilty of this in talking about Jonah and his melancholy. Or alternatively, we cling to utopian possibilities, but in ways that downplay or ignore real evidence of harm. Queer writing about consent, non-consent, and the afters of sexual violence help us to thread this needle. Consider, for example, a suggestion from Leah Lakshmi Pipesna Samar Sinha, writing about trauma and being a survivor. I want to venture, what if some things aren't fixable? What if some things really never will be the same? And that might not be great, but it might be okay. What if some trauma wounds never really go away and we still might have great lives? What if Jonah does not consent, is traumatized and harmed and never recovers? And what if the after is also not a sentence to pain and nothing more? What if instead we take seriously harm without allowing it to be the only thing we're able to think about in prophecy and non consent and in prophecy more broadly? I want to end finally with a vision of failure. I've argued today that the scenes of prophetic calling and scenes of consent and non consent teach us about each other. And nowhere is this truer than in the book of Jonah. It's in such spaces of failure that we find both nuance and possibility. In the words of my dark Vanessa, there must be a point where you're allowed to be defined by something other than what he did to you. So too Jonah. But reaching this point requires us also to take seriously the queer failures of consent. Thank you.